there's indicators that the Fed kind of looks at, and obviously yesterday's inflation report is one of them. And it came in way better than expected. Inflation was 3%, down from 3.3% in May. And consumer prices actually declined for the first time in 4 years. So we saw food inflation is at 1.1%. We've seen declines in inflation in new car prices, used car prices, which really skyrocketed during COVID, and gas prices. So that's very positive news for consumers in that regard. And what we're seeing though is that a lot of families are still struggling because food prices, for example, are up about 21% since COVID. And so we're seeing a lot of low and middle income families going to food pantries to supplement their grocery bill. And you could see it yesterday. PepsiCo, one of the largest consumer packaged goods companies in the country, announced in their earnings call yesterday afternoon that their overall volume, their revenue declined 4%. Although their profitability was up 12%. And they admitted, look, they took aggressive price increases over the last couple of years, but consumers have hit a threshold on, say, a bag of potato chips or a 2-liter bottle of Pepsi or Coke for that matter, right? So that's one important factor. And the second one is that the core inflation was also down as expected, down to 3.3%. That takes out food and energy prices. The one piece of good news that the Fed got finally is that rental or home ownership costs actually increased at the lowest pace in 3 years. And it's interesting. I've said this numerous times in the past. Economists have really expected housing costs to decline. And they know it's a lagging indicator, but they've been saying it for a year and a half. And this is the first month that I think, on the whole, we're seeing some cooling in the housing markets. A lot more apartments and single-family homes have been built, and so that's a positive. And so that'll help accelerate the decline in inflation in the future, we hope. So as we look at what the Fed's going to do, so they're going to meet at the end of the month, and for those who really have hopes that they might cut rates, it's highly unlikely. But now, when the year started, the Fed was expected to cut rates 6 times. And unfortunately, because in the first quarter, we saw inflation kind of stubbornly inch back up, the Fed has really held off. And as early as last month, the chairman of the Fed, Powell, said, look, we may just have one rate cut for the entire year. But June's jobs report and this inflation report might revise the way the Fed might look at this, because we're seeing, so they're looking, as they're going into their meeting at the end of July, a healthy economy, but it's slowing. We have low unemployment, but the rate of hiring has kind of slowed down. Wage growth has kind of slowed down. Consumers are still spending, but they're not spending at the levels they were about a year ago. And so at this point, they're really going to look at a September rate cut, and the likelihood, the people who are handicapping this as a percent, 83% chance that there's going to be a rate cut in September, and there may be 2 rate cuts in 2024 rather than just 1. Target is going to stop accepting checks on Monday, July 15th. So in the kind of the battle between digital and paper currency, score another one for the digital option, as Target, finally said, look, we're not seeing the volume of checks that we have seen in the past. And in fact, their term was extremely low volume of checks. Since the 1990s, in the payments world, a lot has moved to digital currencies. Not only debit and credit cards, ATMs are more prevalent, and they are able to dispense cash instead of the use of checks. And whether you have mobile payments like Zelle, Apple Pay, or Venmo, or online payments, since a lot of people are buying things just directly online, there's probably a large cohort of younger consumers that have never ever written a check in their lives. But to put it in the context, in 2022, Americans did write 3.5 billion checks. Now, that might sound like a lot, but if you go back to 1990, Americans wrote almost 20 billion checks. So it's a huge decline in the number of checks. And the Federal Reserve, as recently as 2003, had 45 check processing locations around the country to process checks. In 2010, that was reduced to one location.